about them Cowboys?
Okay, chill, Skip. One of the greatest dynasties in NFL history ended in a barbershop. I guess you could say it was Barberside. The Dallas Cowboys were already at the tail end of their glory days. Michael Irvin, the unflinching and boisterous leader of the Dallas Triplets, their big three, was on his last legs. He was trying to uphold long-held traditions of winning and respect for a once proud franchise that had fallen on hard times. Irvin wanted a haircut, and he didn't want to wait. Everett McIver was far from a rookie, but he was a new Dallas Cowboy, and that meant if Michael Irvin wanted him to get out of his chair, he had to get out of the chair. McIver refused, and Irvin was irate. The two locked horns until Irvin grabbed a pair of scissors and plunged them, stabbing his teammate in the neck. And the Dallas Cowboys dynasty took its last breath. You may think you know the 90's Cowboys, but you don't. Irvin stabbing his teammate is honestly not the craziest thing I learned about the 90's Cowboys. The least interesting thing about the 90's Cowboys might just be their 3 Super Bowl victories. They are one of the wildest amalgamations of athletes I've ever learned about, and today's episode is going to change your perception of the entire organization. The Cowboys went balls deep into the league and into the world around them, and I'm going the deepest balls deep into, surprisingly, the Cowboys. Please subscribe here. This offseason, I read a book. Yes, believe it or not, I can read. In 2008, a fantastic author named Jeff Pearlman published Boys Will Be Boys, The Glory Days and Party Nights of the Dallas Cowboys, which may be where Jerry Jones actually confused Glory Hole with Glory Days.
I've been here when it was Glory Hole days, and I've been here when it wasn't. And so having said that, I want me some Glory Hole.
It's one of the greatest, most exhaustive sports books ever written, and this is, in a lot of ways, a book report, a tribute to this document of NFL history. So I want to give so much credit to Pearlman for the information he dug up with hundreds of interviews and extensive research. You know, a thing called journalism. I also supplemented this video with my own research, much like Aaron Rodgers, and my biggest takeaway is the 90's Cowboys would have been banned from today's NFL. A PR nightmare that would have been canceled 100 times.
If we made a movie and we did it just purely on facts, and didn't, exaggerate anything that happened, people would not believe it. They'd say there's no way that happened.
And the Cowboys today, they're still an iconic franchise despite failing to reach the NFC Championship game in nearly 3 decades. A lot of that stems from their era as America's team in the 70s, but so much of their intrigue and polarization as a team has to do with their exploits on and off the field in the 90s. They were a dominant and powerful football team by day, and by night, they were some of the most prolific group of partiers and cocksmen the world has ever seen. In 1988, an oil driller from Arkansas was fishing in Cabo, relaxing, reading the Wall Street Journal. He turned to page 8 and saw something that caught his eye. An NFL team was for sale. It was the biggest of big fish, and he was determined to reel it in. That man, of course, was Jerry Jones! And his purchase of dem boys changed the team forever. The Dallas Cowboys were an expansion team established back in 1960, and their first head coach was a man by the name of Tom Landry. Starting in 1966, the Cowboys reeled off 20 straight winning seasons. They won 13 NFC East titles, went to 5 Super Bowls, and won 2 of them. They were, as Bob Ryan of NFL Films dubbed them, America's team. They were actually a likable team, led by a God-fearing father figure in Tom Landry, former Navy officer Roger Staubach at quarterback, nicknamed Captain America, and the stifling doomsday defense that was littered with Hall of Famers. They were an iconic franchise before a meme. They were a brand. They were winners. And then it all went away. There's a game that changed the fortune of the Dallas Cowboys and sent them back to the middle class of the league. Tom Brady was actually at that game. Perhaps you've heard that bit of trivia once or twice or 5,000 times. In January of 1982 in Candlestick Park, the Dallas Cowboys needed one stop to advance to their 7th Super Bowl. They did not get it. Instead, Joe Montana found Dwight Clark in the back of the end zone, the most iconic play in San Francisco 49ers history. And that play ushered in the downfall of America's team. The mystique had gone up in smoke. And just like the 70s had belonged to the Cowboys, and Cheech and Chong also up in smoke, the 80s would belong to the 49ers and the NFC. Following the Cowboys' collapse in the mid to late 80s, Texas oil man Bum Wright was looking to sell his Cowboys. He ended up selling to Jerry Jones, and he had one major stipulation. Jerry would have to fire head coach Tom Landry. That was no problem for Jerry. He already had a replacement coach in mind. After the sale, Landry was out playing golf with his son in Lakeway, Texas, when a group of men approached him. One was Jerry Jones. Jones did what he thought was the right thing and fired him face to face. Jones failed to see how tragic it is when you fuck up a man's golf game for the day. Landry told him that he could have saved his gas, and just like that, the only head coach the Dallas Cowboys had ever known, the stoic figure who had brought them 2 Super Bowls and dragged them out from behind the shadow of John Kennedy, was gone. It was later reported that poor Tom Landry broke down and started crying uncontrollably in the Cowboys locker room when he told his players he was done coaching. And honestly, I wish that's how Bill Belichick would have went out. Try and imagine Bill Belichick crying. I bet you can't. Landry's replacement couldn't have been any more of a polar opposite. Jones hired Jimmy Johnson, usurping the fedora-wearing legend with a man who had an unmistakable head of hair. Oh, that thing could quaffed. Jimmy Johnson was a Texas native before he had perfectly manicured hair. He was actually poor and raised in Port Arthur during the era of segregation, but never cared about anyone's skin color. He played as a quick, undersized nose guard at Arkansas, where he met Jerry Jones and freshman coach Barry Switzer. The two were teammates on the 1964 national championship team for the Razorbacks. Johnson thought he was going to go into psychology, but landed back in football by chance and got his first head coaching job at Oklahoma State before moving on to the University of Miami, where he built one of the most dominant and polarizing teams in college football history. Put simply, Johnson didn't care what his players did, as long as they showed up to class and showed up on the field. He couldn't care less how they carried themselves, whether they were viewed as thugs or convicts or anything else. Johnson was coaching in an era where universities were told to recruit some black players, but not too many black players. And Johnson realized he could have a huge advantage by, recruiting the best players. His Miami team was hated. He was called Pork-Faced Satan by his detractors, and he unflinchingly ran up the score on his opponents. And Johnson did not give a fuck. He was going to build a winner no matter what anyone thought. He had NFL caliber players, and he treated them like men, even if a few of them were getting arrested on gun charges, drug charges, or even siphoning gas. In fact, Johnson would tell his players when to not do drugs or steroids because a drug test was coming. That's really the most players coach ever when you think about it. It all paid off in 1987. The Hurricanes were national champs thanks to Johnson's coaching and a team that included names like Benny Blades, Russell Maryland, Cortez Kennedy, Jeff Beagles, Brett Perryman, Rob Chudzinski, Steve Walsh, and of course a gentleman by the name of Michael Irvin. Michael Irvin was drafted by the Cowboys with the 11th overall pick in the 1988 draft, a year before Johnson arrived to take over the team. Irvin wasn't particularly fast or naturally strong, but he was a hard worker and as fierce of a competitor as there was. He was in the gym or out on the field talking shit bright and early, even if he was out partying until the wee hours of the morning. Irvin's ability to drink and party and fuck multiple women all night long and still be the best and hardest working player on the field, even for practice, is something he did his entire career. Irvin grew up extremely poor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the 15th of 17 children. Philip Rivers ain't got shit on Irvin's mom. He didn't even have his own bed until he got to college. His father was a roofer and died of cancer when Michael was in high school, and it left him broken until he embraced his passion and talent for football that took him through Miami, where he set receptions, yards, and touchdown records for the Hurricanes and into the NFL. Michael Irvin, on his first day with the Cowboys, put his arm around a Tom Landry cardboard cutout at the team facility and loudly exclaimed,
"My new dad. My new dad."
Cowboys officials at the time were quoted saying, "Who did this kid think he was? How dare he speak in such a boastful manner?" Oh no, not a boastful manner. How dare he? But it wasn't smooth sailing. Irvin's first 3 years in the league, a bit of a disappointment, failing to surpass even 700 yards in 1988 to 89 or 90. He was on pace for 1,000 yards in 89, but tore his ACL against the 49ers. Injury or not, he was deemed a bust at the time. Nothing was going the Cowboys' way under new ownership, but the struggling Cowboys were going to make another trade that would change the NFL forever. Running back Herschel Walker was an oddball. He hardly slept, he couldn't dribble a basketball, and he stayed up all night doing push-ups. Later, he'd be diagnosed with dissociative personality disorder, which I believe is the exact moment he was tapped to run for Senate.
Well, first of all, this election is more than Herschel Walker. This election is about the people.
At the time, though, everyone just thought he was weird. And he was. He still is, but he had a reason. He was also one of the best running backs in the NFL, and he was far and away the best player on the Cowboys roster. But the Cowboys were floundering in 1989, the first season under Jimmy Johnson. They were 0-5 and decided it was time to shake things up. Johnson had inherited Herschel Walker, but he wasn't a fan of his rigid running style. He preferred his running backs to be a bit shiftier and more agile, while Walker was a north and south power back. Jimmy Johnson was really the only man who thought it was a good idea to move on from Herschel Walker. The Cowboys started shopping the back, an unthinkable move at the time, and found a buyer in Minnesota. Dallas gave them the 27-year-old Walker, and in return, they got a king's ransom. You might have heard about this story, right? 5 active players from Minnesota and 6 future draft picks. Holy shit. Those picks did turn into Russell Maryland, Kevin Smith, Darren Woodson, and future Hall of Fame running back Emmitt Smith. It's a trade that reshaped the way the league thought about roster building. Following Walker's flameout in Minnesota, front offices finally came to the conclusion that no one player was worth all of those draft picks. Except maybe Mike Ditka. And at the time, the Cowboys were crucified by the media for the trade, and I find it fitting that the smartest move in team history was dubbed a fleecing. Only sports media could see the team acquiring 11 players as the loser of the trade. Vikings executive Mike Lynn, more of a businessman than a football mind, pulled the trigger on the trade before alerting any of the coaches in his building. And when head coach Jerry Burns found out, he was livid. So if there was just a little more communication on the part of the Vikings, the most impactful trade in NFL history might not have happened, and the Cowboys might not have become the dynasty we know them today. Now, in 1988, Landry's final season, he left them with one final gift, the number 1 overall pick. Dallas desperately needed a quarterback, and there was a perfect one waiting for the team. Troy Aikman was not a typical jock. He spent his childhood battling clubbed feet. He stayed wide awake at night thinking about death. Jesus, Troy. He was nearly too shy to play quarterback, and he was baptized as a teenager in an unsuccessful attempt to defeat his anxiety. Weird that dunking a teenage boy who's scared of everything into water didn't cure him of his anxiety. Strange. Aikman was originally recruited by Barry Switzer at Oklahoma, who promised him a Mercedes and gave him a Dodge Dart instead. That's not an analogy. Aikman actually received a Dodge Dart to come play at Oklahoma. Switzer also lured him in with talk of a pass-heavy offense, but pulled the rug out from under Aikman and reverted back to the wishbone offense, causing Troy to transfer to UCLA. Even there, it took Troy a year to hit his stride, and after some serious early struggles, molded himself into the slam dunk first overall pick in 1989. Now, early on, Jimmy Johnson believed that his Miami teams could have beaten the Cowboys team he inherited. He revamped the conditioning program, was unbelievably tough on his players, and once kicked a kicker off the practice field for having an asthma attack during wind sprints.
Asthma, my get over there on that other field and have some asthma. Get out of here.
Coach, I can't breathe. Fuck you, kicker. Jimmy would make Urban Meyer look like a coddling type. Now, Johnson was not an equal opportunity disciplinarian. Oh, no. He picked his disposable players and gave preferential treatment to his stars, and especially the players he had brought to Dallas from the University of Miami. He would snap and cut his fringe players for next to nothing, but the cornerstone players for the Cowboys were given a very long leash.
I'm going to treat every one of you differently. I said, how I treat you is according to how you are on this scale. You work hard, you do everything that we ask, and you're a good player. You're at the top of the scale. If you don't do what I ask you to do and you're not a good player, you're at the bottom of the scale.
It might not have been a popular method, but it worked. And some of his personnel decisions were just as unpopular. After spending the first overall pick on Troy Aikman, Johnson did the unthinkable. His QB at Miami was Steve Walsh, and he was available in the supplemental draft. And Johnson used his first pick in that supplemental draft on Walsh right after picking Troy Aikman, probably where the Falcons got the idea to draft Michael Penix. Jimmy's move made no sense. Dallas was 1-15 in 1989, and so the Cowboys effectively gave up the number 1 overall pick in 1990 to draft another quarterback. It was a blow to Aikman's confidence, a confusing message to the locker room that divided the roster, and at the end of the day, he was implored to start Troy Aikman, and that's ultimately what he did. I think this highlights the dichotomy of who Jimmy Johnson was as a coach. He was smart enough to trade Herschel Walker, but bound by his own ego to not believe in his first overall pick, Troy Aikman, wasting another pick to bring in a different quarterback. Aikman's first season was brutal. He threw twice as many interceptions as touchdowns, and he regularly got the shit beat out of him in a season where he failed to win a single start. But 1990 rolls around. The Cowboys were starting to cash in on the Herschel Walker trade. They needed a back to replace Walker, and that man was Florida runner Emmitt Smith, a young player whose goals included a rushing title, a gold jacket, and the most rushing yards in NFL history. And guess what? He did all of it. A running back who delivers on that many promises? That's the guy who should have been tapped to run for office. But the Cowboys were still finding themselves in Smith's rookie season. They started the year with a 3-7 record, eventually won 4 of their last 6, and headed into the 1991 season with something they hadn't had in years: hope. The Cowboys found their confidence in 1990 by nearly defeating the great John Elway. That's something Perlman specifically mentioned in the book, okay? That's not coming from me. Jimmy Johnson also set his most impressive record, becoming the first NFL head coach to win the AP Coach of the Year award with a losing record. By 1991, the star on the side of the helmet was starting to shine just a little bit brighter. Aikman won 7 of his 12 starts, but it was actually backup quarterback Steve Berline, a cast-off from the Raiders, who ripped off 4 straight wins to end the regular season and vault the Cowboys into the playoffs for the first time since 1985. Berline was starting as Aikman was injured. Aikman was healthy in time for their wildcard matchup with the Chicago Bears, but that pesky Jimmy Johnson decided to stick with Berline, and his backup quarterback helped Dallas win a 4-point game at Soldier Field. In just 2 years, they had gone from 1-15 to nabbing a road playoff victory. Now, the Cowboys had a lot to be proud of, and they definitely were. In fact, They were probably a little too content with their playoff win over the mighty Bears, and a week later they laid an egg in Detroit, losing 38-6 to Barry Sanders and the Lions. It was a catastrophe for the Cowboys in more ways than one. On their final descent into Detroit Metropolitan Airport, the Cowboys charter jet touched down and skidded off course and then returned to the air. It turned out they had almost T-boned another airplane. It was a bad omen. The Lions ran the Cowboys off the field. Johnson replaced Berline with Aikman and promised he would never pull Aikman again. Linebacker Vincent Smith said, "We were good, but we weren't ready yet." And it's true, they were a year away, and Johnson knew it. He told his coaches, "Next year, this shit doesn't happen. Next year, Super Bowl." In the offseason, the Cowboys made a bold move to help get their defense to the next level. They traded for star linebacker Charles Haley, one of the best edge rushers in the league. Now, Haley had already won 2 Super Bowls in San Francisco. He had racked up 45 sacks in the last 4 years, but he had worn out his welcome in the Bay Area.
He was predatory. If you had some physical mark or something that could be made fun of, you just stayed away.
And when I started this video by stating that the Cowboys wouldn't be allowed in today's NFL, it begins with Charles Haley. It turns out he was wearing out more than just his welcome in San Francisco. Haley was what you might call, a crazy person. And by crazy, I mean he was certifiably fucking insane. One of his favorite moves was calling teammates a certain homophobic slur. He also enjoyed starting fights with teammates, even quarterbacks like Steve Young. But his favorite, and I mean his favorite pastime, was whipping out his Jimmy Johnson and giving it the business, so to speak. Haley was whacking it left and right in the locker room, the film room, and literally in team meetings. Yes, he beat his meat during team meetings.
He was predatory.
He'll walk up to you and kind of punch you. He'll grab you in your private area.
Of course, there were other issues with Haley in San Francisco that should have probably alerted the Cowboys to the fact that he was a nutcase, including, but not limited to, Haley cutting a hole in the top of a teammate's $50,000 BMW and then peeing into the interior of the car.
There it was. Glory hole.
Or the time he went to the bathroom, wiped, and threw the toilet paper at his defensive line coach. Imagine the shitstorm that would ensue if Micah Parsons or TJ Watt did that today. These are the exploits of a crazy person who was so good at football that he stuck around long enough to win 5 Super Bowls.
Charles was crazy, man. I love him. He's my brother. And he was crazy enough to get around those guys and get to the quarterback. But crazy he was.
We crucify players for skipping mandatory workouts, saying the wrong thing on Twitter, and Charles Haley played an entire career whilst putting his penis in his teammates' faces, and everyone knew that about him. This might be my favorite quote from the book. When Charles wasn't groping his penis, or damning the white man, or telling a writer to fuck herself with a blowtorch, or calling Jerry Jones Massa Jerry.
Jerry Jones out of Dallas. I'm the owner of the Dallas Cowboys.
Haley was staying late for extra film, providing instruction to rookies and young players. Haley was a guy the Niners didn't want, which made him a fit for the Cowboys. A roster full of players who were unwanted, and that's what Johnson used to motivate them. All the way to Emmitt Smith, who watched in horror as 16 teams passed on him in the draft. Charles Haley would take his meds some days, but mostly he raw-dogged his insanity and his, all that goes to show that the Cowboys were willing to take anyone who could help them win. And Jimmy Johnson was willing to tolerate anyone who made his team better. And Jerry Jones was more than willing to pay those same players.
Everybody in that organization looks at you and they want to be stroked. The only way they're at their best is if you're stroking every one of them.
And I said, Coach, I'm coming.
Some of their other additions were a little more willing to play by the rules, and that included real-life Cowboy tight end Jay Novacek and defensive tackle Chad Hennings, who was originally picked by the Cowboys in 1988 and finally joined the team in 92 after Bill Clinton announced cuts to the military budget. Dallas was rounding into a Super Bowl team, and they knew it. When you became a Cowboy, you had to pass some tests. Not just Jimmy Johnson's conditioning tests either. You were hazed. Rookies had to do menial tasks for veterans, and if they failed to do so, they could be taped to the goalposts on the practice field until they wiggled themselves free hours later. That's what happened to cornerback Kevin Smith, who was taped up for hours in the cold, and when he finally broke free, he had half of his body hair torn off by duct tape. If he were as hairy as me, he might be dead. No, Kelly Clarkson! Also, you had to hang with Michael Irvin. And when you hung out with Michael Irvin, you were going to the strip club.
We love those strip joints.
Irvin and a lot of the Cowboys were either married or in relationships, but that never stopped them from doing anything they wanted. Cowboys rookies and free agent additions would get a taste of what it was like to party into the wee hours of dawn, then report to practice a few short hours later feeling nauseous with eyes bright red. It didn't stop most of them. They were a team of Josh Gordons, both in terms of lifestyle and talent. Of course, they were a young team, so the bill wasn't going to be due anytime soon. The bills were racking up at the local strip clubs, however. Irvin would hand out $1 and $5 bills to his teammates, personally send women their way, and let them enjoy the perks of being a Dallas Cowboy. The Cowboys literally had a position group meeting at the strip club. Even Jimmy Johnson was known to let loose, and once on a team plane post-loss, Johnson had a handful of Heinekens and snapped and belittled linebacker Robert Jones for letting Charles Haley take his seat on the plane. Robert Jones was a player who beat the odds. His father shot and killed his mom in front of him, and despite that, he made it to the NFL. And while he was struggling to find his way in the league, Johnson constantly shit on him. The team was pissed off at Johnson, and in true egotistic fashion, he never apologized to his team. Johnson was the ultimate hard ass, a far different guy than the one we have seen on television for the last 20 years. Backup running back Curvin Richard fumbled in the regular season finale, a meaningless game, and Johnson made an example of him and cut him before the playoffs, even though they wouldn't be able to replace him on the roster. Johnson let his team enter the playoffs a man down, another move from the head coach that made no sense, and yet perfectly described the kind of disciplinarian he could be. He paid Richards to not play for his team in the postseason. On a worse team, it would have been called out as a nonsensical decision, but they were winning, and winning big, so the cracks in the armor didn't show just yet. I mention all of that to try and highlight that the Cowboys were all over the place. The Cowboys were a juggernaut, though, in 1992. They finished 13-3 and atop the NFC East. Troy Aikman threw 23 touchdowns. Irvin had nearly 1,400 yards, and Emmitt Smith had an all-pro season with over 1,700 yards on the ground to go with 19 TDs. The Eagles and their new running back, one Herschel Walker, were no match for the Cowboys in the divisional round. And now it was time to head back to Candlestick Park for a chance to advance to the Super Bowl. This was the same Candlestick where 11 years earlier Joe Montana and Dwight Clark put an end to the Cowboys dynasty of the 70s. Now the Cowboys had a chance to repay the favor. Rookie corner Kevin Smith mercilessly talked shit to the great Jerry Rice. Alvin Harper hauled in a massive catch and run to seal the game, and the Cowboys had booked their ticket to Pasadena where they would meet the Buffalo Bills, winners of 3 straight AFC championship games and a team desperate to get the monkey off their back in the Super Bowl.
And the only thing else I got to say is, how about them Cowboys? Yeah!
Buffalo was a finesse team, though, and Dallas knew it. The proof was right there the week leading up to the Super Bowl when Bills linebacker Darryl Talley was knocked out by Magic Johnson's bodyguard, and none of his teammates came to his defense. Now, the reason Talley was knocked out was because he couldn't stop making fun of Magic Johnson for having AIDS. So he did deserve it, but good teammates have your back no matter what, and the Cowboys would die for each other if necessary. The Cowboys were also rubbing elbows with celebrities like Gene Hackman, Tom Berenger, and even Betty White. They were enjoying the nightlife in LA leading up to the big game. None more than Michael Irvin, who was spotted escorting roughly a dozen women up to his hotel room in the span of 4 days.
First of all, we thought we were a Hollywood team anyway, and now we are actually in Hollywood, man. We had a great week.
Even the kicker, Lynn Elliott, who was balding and wore glasses, was cleaning up. Elliott said, "Being a Cowboy, women came easy. If I had practiced kicking footballs as hard as I worked on chasing girls and drinking beers, I'd have a 15-year career." Even Jimmy Johnson got his turn, kissing MTV BJ Downtown Julie Brown on the lips after she ran her hands through his famous head of hair. That might just be the most 90s thing that's ever happened. The point is, the Cowboys' level of attention and celebrity was unmatched by any NFL team ever. They were treated like rock stars, acted like rock stars, and performed like rock stars, and were above the law like rock stars. Dallas, though, hadn't been to the Super Bowl, and the Bills, like Timothy Leary, were on their third straight trip. Dallas was younger. They should have been nervous, but they were as loose as it gets, probably from all the cocaine streaming through their body, and it showed on the field. Buffalo took a quick touchdown lead in the first quarter before Dallas made it rain on the Bills. MVP Troy Aikman threw 4 touchdowns, 2 to Irvin, and the Cowboys would have set the scoring record in any Super Bowl if one Leon Lett had kept the ball. He later said, "He made a mistake, that's all. We met up a few months after the Super Bowl and I asked him how his life had changed. He told me that people were very hard on him. For God's sake, they won the dang game." Aikman made the easiest $50,000 of his life for saying, "I'm going to Disney World!" And the Cowboys celebrity hit an even higher level. This is when shit started to get crazy. They were showing up on radio, on TV, and in songs. Troy Aikman and a few others even formed a country band in the offseason, and the results were truly disastrous.
This old pickup truck and me.
The Cowboys charity basketball team turned into a purely capitalistic venture, a fight club, and unsurprisingly, another way for Michael Irvin and Alvin Harper to get laid. The team was called the Hoopsters. The players started charging insane appearance fees to play. You know, for charity. And Michael Irvin took the game so seriously, he punched a ref in the face, again, for charity. Mostly they kept playing so they could sleep with the women who came to watch them hoop. The team was originally formed in the early 70s by wide receiver Drew Pearson, but when the 90s iteration of America's team got on the court, they were asking for $25,000 checks to play. They did coke and got drunk after the games, and on their private plane, they once watched as a pair of 2 women put on a show for them. And it was all for charity, of course. Alvin Harper liked to fornicate so much, the team nicknamed him Freaky Harp. If you're the freaky dude on a team who has a guy who jerks it in team meetings, you might need some help.
Is somebody gonna match my freak?
Harper was actually banned from the men's club of Dallas for having sex in a phone booth. Talk about a pricey collect call, right? One thing the Cowboys loved was ejaculating at 30,000 feet in the air. For most people, the Mile High Club is unattainable, but not for the Dallas Cowboys, and not for the Denver Broncos either, when you really kind of think about it. A lot of owners might have been concerned with the sexual exploits of their team, but not Jerry Jones. He simply chalked it up to boys being boys. And when the team made a deal with American Airlines as their official carrier, they sought out the most attractive flight attendants, keeping a book of photos and measurements of their top picks. A tier list, if you will. Needless to say, I don't think that would fly today. No pun intended. Meanwhile, the only Johnson not fully satisfied on the team was Jimmy. Nothing satisfied that man, and he was running practices in the off-season that were called suicidal, all in the pursuit of going back-to-back. The Cowboys, despite having the best running back in the league, not named Barry Sanders, were playing hardball with Emmitt Smith's contract. For the first 2 weeks of the 1993 season, Smith held out for a bigger, better deal, and the Cowboys started the year 0-2. Smith eventually re-entered the lineup after prolonged negotiations that almost saw him re-enroll in college, and the Cowboys rediscovered their elite form on the field. In their last 14 games of the regular season, the Cowboys won 12. Smith still ran for nearly 1,500 yards in the final game of the season. He overcame a dislocated shoulder to run for 168 yards, leading the Cowboys to an overtime victory that secured them a first-round bye. John Madden was so impressed by Smith that for the first time ever, he went down to the locker room after the game so he could shake Smith's hand. Now, at the time, Smith's ego was rubbing his teammates the wrong way. For example, Smith gifted his teammates his own autobiography for Christmas and then refused to autograph it for one of his teammates' moms. But performances like playing through excruciating pain of a separated shoulder endeared him to those men forever. The Cowboys had no trouble in the playoffs, beating the Packers and 49ers by a combined 27 points, advancing to the Super Bowl, where they would once again meet the poor Buffalo Bills. Atlanta did not provide the same temptation that LA did a year earlier, and the game lacked the buzz of Super Bowl 27 for the team that already possessed a ring. It didn't matter. They were 10.5-point favorites and reeled off 17 straight points to win 30-13. Emmitt Smith was the MVP, and the Cowboys were back-to-back champs, already solidifying their position as the team of the 90s before the decade was half over. Everything should have felt perfect in Dallas. But it wasn't. This is the dumbest part of the Cowboys dynasty. Behind the scenes, two alpha males running the show were jockeying for credit and adulation of having built the super team. Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson had known each other for decades, succeeded together, but their precarious bond was starting to unravel. Jones believed, or at least told people he believed, that he could coach the Cowboys if he felt inclined to do so. And Johnson wanted Jerry Jones to stay out of the football side of the operation, keep signing checks, and shut the hell up. That was obviously never going to happen. Jones took credit for deals that Johnson made and got pissed off when trades happened behind his back. Johnson was getting all the credit from the sports writers, and when Jones got his chance to tell his side of the story at the annual NFL owners meetings in Orlando in March of 1994, he took it and ran with it. Very late one night, Jones was letting the scotch do the talking, and talk he did to reporter Ed Werder. Jones told Werder, "Let me buy you a drink. You sure as hell don't want to go to bed and miss the biggest story of the year." The story was pretty straightforward. He was going to fire Jimmy Johnson on the heels of 2 Super Bowl wins and replace him with Barry Switzer. It's a decision you make when you're shit-faced and go back on when the sober light of the morning hits your face and reality creeps back into your mind. For Jerry Jones, though, it's possible he just never sobered up. Johnson was gone. Switzer was on the phone. And when Barry Switzer got the call asking him to coach the Dallas Cowboys, he was still a little out of it from having just received a colonoscopy. Switzer had won it all at Oklahoma, but by 1994, he'd been away from the game of football for 5 years. To highlight how clueless he was, Switzer didn't even know what division the Cowboys played in when Jerry Jones called him up. Switzer always had a positive attitude, even despite a tragic upbringing that included growing up dirt poor to a bootlegger father and his mother taking her life just feet away from him as a young man. And like so many others in the NFL, Switzer found solace in football, getting into coaching and building a powerhouse at Oklahoma. Like Jimmy Johnson, but to a much greater extent, Switzer turned his back on his players' extracurricular activities. Until, of course, it got so bad that Switzer was forced to resign. And when he did come back to football, he was joining the horniest, most godless, and the greatest team the NFL had to offer. Remember, Switzer was the man who initially recruited Troy Aikman to Oklahoma and subsequently drove him to UCLA, where he really became Troy Aikman. Aikman still harbored some animosity for the coach who lied to him, but he was going to have to play for him whether he wanted to or not. A lot of players initially, and even people in the press, really liked Switzer, unlike Jimmy Johnson. But they also didn't respect Switzer, unlike Jimmy Johnson. In a lot of ways, I'm the Barry Switzer of sports YouTube. With Johnson, at least there was some kind of standard. Under Switzer's watch, there was basically no watch. Everybody was letting loose, even Switzer and Jerry Jones.
Troy, I'll never forget one time said, "We need some harder, more physical practices." Now, Barry winked and said, "You know, the only one I've ever heard say that's a quarterback."
Why don't we have a coach that gets over there and does something about it? Instead, we want to go over and pat everybody on the ass, and they haven't done a job all night.
In his first team meeting, Barry Switzer called out to Charles Haley, yelling, "Damn it, where's Charles Haley?" And when Haley stood up, Switzer continued, "I'm mad at you. I heard you flick your dick at everybody, and you didn't do it to me. What am I, chopped liver?" And that joke got a big laugh and instantly illustrated how different things would be with Johnson's departure. Now, before Michael Vick, Cowboys lineman Nate Newton ran into some dogfighting issues of his own. He also had DUIs, and he also forfeited $80,000 because he couldn't make weight. But when he was fined $80,000 for being too fat, he said, "If someone offers you 80 grand to be unhappy, fuck 80 grand.
They had an assistant equipment manager named Jerry Fowler who said, if William Perry is the fridge, this guy's got to be the kitchen.
Dogfighting, DUIs, it didn't matter. If you had the star on your helmet, you were untouchable. Now, the team had a routine where they would meet at a place called Cowboys Cafe, where wives and girlfriends were not allowed and where Charles Haley once drove a motorcycle through the lobby. Driving under the influence wasn't much of a stigma for the Cowboys until, of course, Pro Bowl right tackle Eric Williams nearly died after crashing his car with a blood alcohol level of 0.17 the night after a game. But even near-death experiences didn't cause any self-reflection for the Cowboys, and the party just kept going. And the number one spot for partying? Well, that was a little place called the White House. Not the same White House where the Cowboys had been honored for their Super Bowl victories, although Bill Clinton treated it in a very similar manner. I'm talking about a handful of the most debaucherous Cowboys buying a house together in the suburbs of Dallas and turning it into a den of sin to the likes of which the league had never seen. Prostitutes, cocaine, sex toys, black light stains everywhere, even on the landline. It was a place for everything you couldn't do in restrictive strip clubs. The first person to write about the White House was a guy named Dan Le Batard, and when Jerry Jones and Barry Switzer were forced to comment on the house's existence, they had to pretend to be shocked. Jones wasn't necessarily at the White House himself, but he knew about it because he was after the same women as his players. Jones had gotten his way on the coaching front, but as a result, the Cowboys weren't the disciplined unit they had been under Jimmy Johnson. They were still winning, but they were doing it in spite of Switzer. There might have been a three-peat under Jimmy Johnson, but with Barry, the team fell in the NFC title game to San Francisco, who finally broke free of the Cowboys and won another Super Bowl. The piece that pushed San Francisco over the top had been Defensive Player of the Year, Neon Deion Sanders. And Jerry Jones wanted him. So Jerry went out and got Deion in 1995. Now the Cowboys won that following season in spite of Switzer and in some ways in spite of Deion and his new contract. Now Sanders was mostly a non-factor his first year in Dallas, and his lack of work ethic didn't bother Barry Switzer, but it did rub some of his teammates the wrong way. Offensive lineman Dale Hellestrae said, "You lead by example," and Deion's example wasn't very good. Sanders didn't even join the team until Halloween, intercepted 2 passes all season, and was outplayed by Kevin Smith, the corner on the other side of the field who shit-talked Jerry Rice 3 years earlier. Now, Deion wasn't as loved in the locker room as you've been led to believe. And I think this has always been true of Deion Sanders, and we're seeing it with him as a head coach. If he likes you, he's the best dude to be around. He's got your back. And he does genuinely kind things, like gifting one of the Cowboys players a car for his jersey number when he first arrived. He also does shit like accuse Troy Aikman of being racist, along with John Blake. Deion is two-faced. He's accused Troy of being racist, but also defended Troy when Skip Bayless accused Troy Aikman of being gay.
Where do you get off stating that one of my teammates is a homosexual? Where are your facts?
Gay racists? Talk about a minority of minorities.
I'm not gay, but Troy is a good-looking guy.
But back to Deion accusing Troy of being racist. Barry Switzer pulled Troy Aikman into his office where he told Troy that some of the black players don't think you're being fair to them, that you only yell at the black players and not the white guys. He went on to ask Troy Aikman to apologize to Kevin Williams, who Troy had got heated with at practice. An unfounded, and dumb accusation. One that led to more conflict between Aikman and Switzer. One the entire team found out about as well. Deion had been there all of 5 minutes, but the dudes who knew Troy came to his defense. Irvin, Haley, Newton. Corner Kevin Smith noted that when you hear things like Troy is unliked, that comes straight from Blake and Deion. Deion was also made fun of for making business decisions on the field his first season there, accumulating just 22 tackles. Now, the craziest thing that I thought when reading through this book was, what if Deion Sanders had the same work ethic as Michael Irvin? How fucking good would Deion Sanders have been? He's already one of the best to ever do it, and he didn't put in the work. Now, the Cowboys were still underachieving and still cruising to the playoffs in '95. Leon Lett and Clayton Holmes were suspended on drug charges. It didn't matter. Switzer's prep and the game plans were lackluster, but the team Jimmy Johnson had assembled and coached up were still far superior than their opponents. Dallas vanquished Brett Favre and the Packers in the NFC title game and were back in the Super Bowl where they'd play the Steelers, the team that had bested them in the big game twice in the 70s. Now, back in the 70s, those two teams were worthy competitors. In 1995, it felt like the Cowboys and Steelers were on different trajectories. Dallas was a team not living up to its potential, and the Steelers were overachieving with a strong defense and an offense captained by a suspect leader at QB, Neil O'Donnell. On paper, it was an easy win for the Cowboys, but they spent the days leading up to the Super Bowl trying to up the difficulty a bit. Once again, for the Cowboys, the Super Bowl was simply a party well before the game kicked off. A handful of players paid for 11 stretch limousines to drive the players and their women of choice 16 hours to Arizona, the site of Super Bowl 30. One team employee said, "The limo thing was as blatant as anything the Cowboys had ever been a part of. We had this huge caravan arrive from Dallas, and some guys had a bunch of their dancer girlfriends ride out and party with them. The reason they did this was actually mature. They wanted to bring women they could trust from Dallas to party with to avoid any issues with unknown women. They brought the White House to Arizona."
I said to him, I said, "Boss, I was trying to do the wrong thing the right way."
But it was the head coach who really let loose that week. Switzer had turned his 2-room hotel suite in Arizona into a 24-hour rave with people flowing in and out, believing it would be the only time he'd be at the Super Bowl. So he might as well live it up. I like to imagine it's like if Michael Scott had a successful party from that episode of The Office in the hotel room. But Switzer did live it up, racking up a liquor bill totaling over $100,000 by the end of the week. If we're being honest, that's one of the most impressive stats the Dallas Cowboys ever posted in the 1990s. Imagine an NFL head coach doing that shit today during Super Bowl week. Kyle Shanahan was crucified for losing a backpack. What if he was drunk all week? Switzer said, "I didn't know if we'd win or lose the Super Bowl, but I knew I was going to have one heck of a week." And you have to give him that because he was very, very right about not returning to the Super Bowl. Larry Brown was far from a household name. The Cowboys drafted him in the 12th round of the 1991 draft for a pretty simple reason. He went to nearby TCU and they wouldn't have to pay for a flight to get him out to their facility in Valley Ranch.
Jimmy said, "I'm through." He goes, "We got one more pick in the 12th. And he goes, "Why don't we do Jerry a favor and pick somebody local so they can just drive in. We don't need to fly them in."
Now, Brown had been a contributor, but not a star on the first two Super Bowl teams. But in Super Bowl 30, he was the MVP for one reason. He was in the right place at the right time twice. Brown, of course, intercepted 2 of Neil O'Donnell's most head-scratching passes, which the Cowboys offense turned into 2 touchdowns. They were, for the 3rd time in 4 years, Super Bowl champs. Brown, who had lost his son just a couple months before after being born 14 weeks premature, became just the 2nd defensive back to win the game's MVP. He said, "I just thank God. He gave me the strength to get through this year. It was tough with the team and the players and the way they supported me through all of the hard times. I've just got to give them credit. I couldn't have done it without them." Of course, he couldn't have done it without a little help from Neil O'Donnell either. Thanks to a strong season and the Super Bowl accolades, Larry Brown was rather predictably overpaid by the Oakland Raiders in free agency. The Cowboys, though, they were at the peak of their powers, and yet they were due for a decline. They had essentially sleptwalked their way to a Super Bowl and may not have won it if not for O'Donnell's all-time blunders. It was a testament to their talent and not so much anything else that they had squeezed a third ring out of that incredible roster, but it wasn't going to last. They were tried and true celebrities, and that meant celebrity treatment in all of the worst ways. A year after beating the Steelers in the Super Bowl, the Cowboys were 10-6 despite the 25th scoring offense in the league. They ran through the Vikings in the wild card round but fell to the Panthers a week later, a team in just their second year of existence. The team was getting older. Emmitt Smith was not his usual self. Michael Irvin failed to reach 1,000 receiving yards, and Troy Aikman was feeling the sting of multiple career concussions. By 1997, the team's record flipped to just 6-10, falling in the final 5 games of the regular season, an unprecedented collapse for Dallas. Off the field, the media had completely caught on to the Cowboys' fast-living style. Players were getting suspended for drugs, they were wrecking their cars, and Eric Williams was charged with assaulting a 16-year-old dancer. Irvin had arrived at a drug treatment center in Dallas alongside a 7-person entourage, and needless to say, the treatment did not take. The Cowboys had always been one of the best drafting teams in the league, but no more was the case after Jimmy Johnson left. Without Jimmy Johnson, Jerry Jones was in over his head when it came to actual X's and O's. There was one thing that ultimately 2 Dallas Cowboys did not do, but it was as costly as anything else that they had done previously. 3 days after beating the Vikings in the 1996 playoffs, a 23-year-old woman accused Michael Irvin of holding a gun to her head while Eric Williams and another man assaulted her. They were later proven innocent, but the media ran with that story and it tore the Cowboys apart from the inside, contributing to their loss to Carolina. As for Irvin, he was injured in the opening minutes of the game and watched as the lowly Panthers beat up on the team of the early 90s. 2 years later, the dynasty hit its lowest point when Irvin plunged a pair of scissors into the neck of offensive lineman Everett McIver. McIver was not a rookie, but Irvin was treating him like one. Seniority, seniority, Irvin kept saying. Other players pushed back against Irvin, who was trying to kick McIver out of his chair so that he could get his haircut. McIver had about 100 pounds and 3 inches on Irvin, so the receiver grabbed a pair of scissors and used them as a weapon, just missing McIver's carotid artery. New Cowboys head coach Chan Gailey was rightfully appalled by the incident, but McIver's neck thankfully healed from the attack, and the Cowboys kept him quiet with a high 6-figure payout. Later referring to the assault as horseplay. Irvin was already on probation after being arrested for possession of cocaine, and the hush money likely kept him from being shipped off to jail. A judge had told him earlier that if he came back before him, he would be facing 20 years in a penitentiary. McIver has denied that he ever received money from the Cowboys to keep quiet, but of course that's the point of getting hush money, right? You shut up about it. A year later, Michael Irvin's career came to an abrupt end in year 12. During the 5th game of the 99 season, Michael Irvin was hit by Philadelphia Eagles defensive back Tim Hawk and driven headfirst into the turf at Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia. He sustained a cervical spine injury, which, although not life-threatening, required him to be carted off the field and transported to Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. Irvin did not play again for the rest of the season and was subsequently diagnosed with cervical spinal stenosis. Advised that another blow to the neck or head could result in severe injury, Michael Irvin announced his retirement in May of 2000. The playmaker retired with 750 career receptions, tied with Charlie Joyner for 30th all-time in NFL history, and caught 87 passes in the playoffs, second behind Jerry Rice at the time of his retirement. Irvin was the last player coached by Tom Landry to retire from the NFL. The original coach of the Dallas Cowboys. Landry passed away on February 12th of 2000. In August of 2007, Michael Irvin was enshrined in the NFL Hall of Fame and was one of the mainstays at ESPN and the NFL Network for most of the 21st century.
The young ladies today, they're not learning from mom how to cook with losing recipes.
Perhaps his greatest claim to fame, however, was his appearance in 2 Adam Sandler films, The Longest Yard and, of course, the tour de force, Jack and Jill. That's right, Michael Irvin shares an IMDb credit with Al Pacino. Troy Aikman played just one more season than Michael Irvin, retiring in 2000 after just 12 years in the NFL. A short QB career by today's standards, Aikman suffered countless concussions, including a handful in his last season, and it made sense to retire when he did. By the time he hung up the cleats, he had won 94 games, 90 of them coming in the 90s, the most any QB has had in a single decade until Peyton Manning won 115 games in the 2000s. Manning also won 55 games in the 2010s, but hey, who's really counting? For 2 decades, Aikman has been the right-hand man for Joe Buck in the broadcast booth at Fox and ESPN, but whenever he calls Cowboys games, he's the shadow lingering over the franchise, whoever is under center for Dallas. Whether that's Tony Romo or Dak Prescott or anyone else, they'll be compared to 2 guys, Roger Staubach and Troy Aikman, and the standard will always be not just one, but multiple Super Bowl rings. And that's the reality of playing quarterback in Dallas. Whatever you do, don't listen to some stat nerd trying to tell you Troy Aikman was overrated, because he wasn't. He might actually be the best numbers do lie QB ever. I hated him and the Cowboys as a kid, but he was tough as nails, and he had a bond with Michael Irvin that will put your faith back in humanity. And he simply got the job done by understanding the game at an incredibly high level. And out of all the triplets, Emmitt Smith hung on with the Cowboys the longest, finally achieving his goal of becoming the NFL's all-time leading rusher in 2002 and Dancing with the Stars Season 3 champion in 2006. Smith would finish his career with over 18,000 yards, spending his final 2 seasons where most seniors go to retire, the dry heat of Phoenix, Arizona with the Cardinals. In a lot of ways, Emmitt Smith was the piece that put the Cowboys over the top. And in some ways, it was also ironic. The Cowboys proved that running backs weren't worth as much as we thought. And yet, it was a running back that helped carry them to 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. After he was fired by Jerry Jones, Jimmy Johnson, of course, headed back down to Miami, where he became the head coach for the Miami Dolphins, taking over for the legendary Don Shula. If there was anyone equipped for succeeding an icon, it was Johnson, but he never found the same success in Southern Florida. Johnson, too, has retired to television, where he became one of the many talking heads for Fox's pregame show. He's also spent a large portion of his retirement sailing and appearing in Extends commercials, and even competing on Survivor in 2010, which he called the most stressful time I've ever gone through in my life. He also famously made Troy Aikman cry when he showed him what Extends did for him down there.
I said, Coach, I'm coming.
There it was. Glory hole.
Jerry Jones still assumes the stress of running America's team. Since the Cowboys won the Super Bowl in January of 1996, they have yet to return even to the NFC Championship game. Jones has become a better drafter since the late 90s, but that's likely because he's delegated those types of duties to people who know more about football than him, which is to say, most people who are involved in football. The Cowboys will forever be chasing the early 90s. It's the standard they set for themselves and the standard they've yet to achieve again. Those players and coaches were larger than life, and now they're the prominent ghosts that haunt Jerry World. But man, were they a lot of fun. And crazy. Charles Haley, you were crazy.
Predatory.
Thanks for watching That's Good Sports' longest produced episode ever. Holy shit, I can't believe you guys watched this whole video. If you did, subscribe. Thank you guys. I don't know if I'll ever do another one this long. That was, whew.